Okay. Well, we're now in the wrong place. Where was please? So now that you've met Mrs. Mandelbaum, I'd like you to come along with me to her home. The place is New York City and the time is the summer of 1884. I'm going to read to you now from the prologue to the book. You've had much of it already explained, but let's see how I can do. It's titled A Glittering Hoard. They were detectives accustomed to plunder, but they'd never seen anything like this. It had taken some doing to open the safe. After bursting into the modest haberdashery shop on Manhattan's Lower East Side, they demanded the keys from the shopkeeper, Frederica Mandelbaum. But Mrs. Mandelbaum, a towering woman of 59, tastefully attired in diamond cluster earrings and a lace-trimmed gown of dotted blue, held firm. No, she declared in her heavy Germanic English, just to think of such a thing. Her refusal forced the detectives, employees of the storied Pinkerton agency, to become safecrackers themselves. They summoned a blacksmith who arrived at the shop with hammer and chisel. He attacked the safe. Amid the din, a pretty teenage girl ran in from the next room, Mrs. Mandelbaum's daughter, Annie. "Stop!" Annie cried. She handed over the keys and the safe was unlocked. And Aladdin's cave spilled out. There were gems and jewelry of every description, rings, chains, scarf pins, bracelets, glittering cufflinks and collar buttons, almost every ornament you could mention, one detective recalled. Beside them were heaps of gold watches and, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, watch movements and cases. There was a clutch of fine silverware. There were loose diamonds the size of peas. Elsewhere, in the shop's clandestine back rooms, protected by a metal grid and linked to the outdoors by a set of secret passages, the detectives came upon priceless antique furniture, a trunk brimming with shawls of the finest cashmere and curtains of exquisite lace, and bolts of silk worth thousands of dollars alone. Concealed under newspapers were bars of gold, fathomed from melting down jewelry. Upstairs, in Mrs. Mandelbaum's gracious bedroom, they found melting pots and scales for weighing gold and diamonds. She and an employee were promptly arrested. With that, the Pinkerton detectives, who had staged the raid at the behest of the city's district attorney, accomplished in a single outing what New York's police force had not managed to do in more than 20 years. You are caught this time, and the best thing that you can do is to make a clean breast of it. One of the Pinkertons, Gustav Frank, advised Mrs. Mandelbaum as she was led away. In reply, Frederica Mandelbaum, upright widow, philanthropic synagogue goer, doting mother of four, and boss of the country's most notorious crime syndicate in the world, and punched him in the face. For 25 years, Frederica Mandelbaum reigned as one of the most infamous underworld figures in America. Working from her humble Manhattan storefront, she presided over a multi-million-dollar criminal operation that centered on stolen luxury goods and later diversified into bank robbery. Conceived in the mid-1800s, long before the executive started making organized crime in the United States, her empire extended across the country and beyond. In 1884, the New York Times called her the nucleus and center of the whole organization of crime. Revered in some quarters, reviled in others, Margolit Mandelbaum, as she is known, towered over the city as an earthy, expansive, diamond-encrusted presence, self-made entrepreneur, generous philanthropist, thieves mentor, and gracious society hostess who applied her illicit trade largely in the open. A swath of the public admired her. Many criminals adored her. Over the course of her long, lucrative career, she would spend scarcely a day behind bars. Late 19th century newspapers reveled in Marm's doing and liked to say she could unload anything, including, in one account, a flock of stolen sheep. But it is beyond that by the mid-1880s, as much as $10 million, about 300 million in today's money, had passed through her little haberdashery shop on the Lower East Side. The story of her rise to underworld stardom is a window onto a little explored side of Gilded Age America, the world of Herbert Asbury's Gangs of New York, from the perspective of a sharp-witted, fiercely determined woman. Some modern observers have called Mrs. Mandelbaum a proto-feminist. She was, though she appeared as committed to wifely and maternal duties as any woman of her era. What can be said with certainty is that she was among the first, quite possibly the very first, to systematize the formerly scattershot enterprise of property crime, working out logistics, organizing chains of supply and demand, and constructing the entire venture, first and foremost, as a business. And in so doing, she simultaneously embodied and upended the cherished rags to riches narrative of Victorian America, starring on entirely her own terms in a Horatio Alger story of a very different kind. And so ends our preface. Now, I first became aware of Frederica Mandelbaum several years ago because she was always there for the taking, yet in a certain tantalizing way, also not there, seemingly unknowable, a ghost. Although Mandelbaum gets passing mentions in a great many books on New York City history, there are very few extended treatments of her life and work. But even what little I was able to read caused her to seize hold of me and me to seize hold of her in return. What tantalized me above all was a single fundamental question. How could this be? How could a woman, a penniless Jewish immigrant, woman had risen to become a pillar of her community, an admired philanthropist, and a sought-after society hostess. And this is an engraving of one of her parties. There she is at the head. All because she had simultaneously risen to become the head of the most successful and the most notorious crime syndicate in America. How could she have amassed a personal fortune of as much as $1 million, equivalent to some 20 million today? And all this more than half a century before Prohibition, the widely accepted starting date for organized crime in America, an era in which women, if they figured at all, little more than gangsters' molls. Two other things about Frederica Mandelbaum struck me right away. First, that she ran her criminal empire largely in the open, and during her 25-year reign, didn't spend even a single day in jail. And second, that unlike the male monsters who came after her, she pursued non-violent crime. She made her fortune as a receiver of stolen goods, a fence, to use the colloquial term, covertly buying, cleverly disguising, and quietly reselling a welter of luxury items, all expertly purloined by the cadre of foot soldiers at her beck and call. So, what exactly does a fence do? A fence converts plunder into cash. As long as there have been robbers, there have been receivers of stolen goods. For while a robber may be really good at stealing things, he rarely has the contacts, the time, or the social finesse to sell his wares onward for a good profit. That is where the fence comes in. There were generations of fences before Mrs. Mandelbaum. There have been generations after, right up to the present. But what she did had by all accounts not been done so systematically or so efficiently before. She took the haphazard, disorganized business of property crime and streamlined it into a well-oiled underworld corporate machine, presiding over an army of shoplifters, housebreakers, and jewel thieves. She masterminded robberies of gold, silver, silk, and diamond. Before long, she was also masterminding bank robberies. Frederica Mandelbaum, as with her, literally towered over her era. She was reported to have stood almost 6 feet tall and weighed nearly 300 pounds. Pouchy face and apple cheek, she resembled nothing so much as I had the pleasure of writing as the product of a congenial liaison between a dumpling and a mountain. Many of her contemporaries venerated her as a kind of Robin Hood figure. She robbed from the rich and gave, or rather sold at below wholesale prices to the country's new, upwardly mobile middle class. Mrs. Mandelbaum was also venerated as a den mother of the American underworld. She wined and dined her foot soldiers at the groaning table in her opulent Lower East Side home. She supplied bail money when they were arrested, and my favorite thing, she furnished getaway horses and carriages when they had to flee the scene of a crime. For the maternal care and feeding that she lavished on her employees as well as on her own 4 children, criminals and the press called her mother Mom or Marm Mandelbaum. In her day, Marm Mandelbaum was literally world famous. the subject of newspaper articles, editorial cartoons, and even a couple of stage plays. And by the way, we know for a fact that she went to see this play in 1874, dressed in her fabulous diamonds and silk, and was absolutely incensed, not at the fact that she was being portrayed on stage as a criminal, that was fine, but how frightfully her character was costumed. So incensed, in fact, that she summoned the manager of the theater and gave him a good tongue lashing. But over time, like so many of history's women, Frederica Mandelbaum was largely lost to public memory. And so, as I undertook my journey in search of her, I realized that I would have to piece together, clue by tiny historical clue, the solution to the riddle of what had made her career possible in the first place. When you write historical nonfiction, your first port of call is always the archive of personal papers that your subject has thoughtfully left behind for posterity. In Mrs. Mandelbaum's case, there weren't any. Frederica Mandelbaum was nobody's fool. She clearly knew that in her line of work, committing anything to paper would be professional suicide. And so, for more than a year, I sifted these scattered, widely atomized records of the past in search of glimmers of her life. Take a look. And what you see on the screen is perhaps 2% of the total. It was an intense, sometimes frustrating, but nearly always pleasurable process that felt a bit like hanging through gold. Here is one of the treasures that surface in this age when everyone's getting indicted. This is her, they spelled her name wrong, this is her indictment from 1884. And in the end, when I amassed enough of these little flashes to be able to join them all together, what they revealed illuminated not only Mrs. Mandelbaum and her era, but also the America of our own time. Frederica Mandelbaum was 25 when she came to New York in 1850. She had been born Frederica Weisner in Kassel, in what is now central Germany, one of 7 children in a family of threadbare Jewish peasants. At 23, she married Wolf Mandelbaum, also a peddler. Their first child, Bertha, was born the next year. If the Mandelbaums were to remain in the old country, a future of unremitting hardship was assured. Jews in German lands were subject to restrictions on the trades they could apply and the areas in which they could live. They sometimes met with violence at the hands of Gentile natives. In addition, the region was beset by a severe economic depression and, as an island, a potato famine. In 1850, the Mandelbaums joined thousands of others from the region and emigrated to America. Wolf left first, with Frederica and baby Bertha following behind. Mother and daughter made the Atlantic crossing not by steam, but by sail, a voyage of 6 weeks or more below deck in steerage, dark, cramped, malodorous, filthy. In New York, the Mandelbaums settled on the Lower East Side in an area known as Klein Deutschland, Little Germany, one of America's first major immigrant enclaves. They lived there in abject poverty in a series of shabby, overcrowded tenements without running water or sanitation facilities of any kind. This is the Jacob Rees photograph. The streets were strewn with garbage, snapped at by bands of roaming pigs. Backyards were filled with sewage from overflowing communal outhouses. And there, amid the unhygienic conditions, the infant Bertha Mandelbaum died. It is virtually certain that she succumbed to one of the contagious diseases, typhoid, consumption that ran through the tenements like living bushfires. And yet, this was the start of the era that would soon be called the Gilded Age. Uptown, titans of industry, Astors, Vanderbilts, Rockefellers were erecting their mansions, marble palaces awash in gold and silk and old master paintings. Downtown, thousands of immigrants, and Mandelbaums among them, were simply trying to survive. But how could they survive? While no one had yet thought to charge immigrants with the crime of eating their neighbor's household pets, they suffered discrimination and disenfranchisement the worst kind. The jobs available to immigrants then were overwhelmingly dangerous, demeaning, and low paying. A man might be hired to dig ditches, haul bricks on his shoulders, or load ship's cargo on the waterfront. There was no occupational safety. Workers could be injured or killed, falling from building sites, or be crushed by the wayward cargo. When bad weather concluded outdoor work, there was no pay. For immigrant women, job prospects were even more dire. Confined mostly to domestic service, a woman might be hired as a live-in housekeeper, a position entailing back-breaking labor of 16 hours a day for little more than food, board, and $1 a week. As a result, whether in bold self-determination or desperate last resort, some immigrants turned to illicit activity, climbing the so-called crooked ladder as a way to provide for their families. But even in the underworld, there turned out to be far more opportunities for men than for women. Men could become fences, they could run numbers rackets, illegal gambling joints, they could work as hired muscle or help get out the vote for the tallying wall machine. But for women, there were pretty much only two choices: shoplifting and, it's kind of prostitution. Shoplifting was so small time that it pretty much guaranteed a woman would remain independent. Prostitution guaranteed that she would die young. In the New York of Mrs. Mandelbaum's day, the average life expectancy for a woman entering the trade was 4 years. Now, for a proper married woman like Frederica Mandelbaum, prostitution was clearly off the table, but it's also clear that she was absolutely determined not to remain in poverty. As I researched Frederica's story, one of the things that struck me was that at bottom, it's about entrepreneurship. I know going in, of course, that it was a historical true crime tale, and also a largely forgotten piece of women's history, but I hadn't quite realized that it's also a business story. And what's especially striking about the business aspect of this story is how closely Frederica's step-by-step rise as an underworld entrepreneur paralleled the rise of entrepreneurs in the upper world, the realm of legitimate commerce. For instance, just as you can't walk into a corporate headquarters with the ink still wet on your MBA and the name of CEO, You can't start out being organized crime by becoming the boss. You start at the bottom and work your way up. And that, in the 1850s, is exactly what Frederica Mandelbaum began to do. After the Mandelbaums settled on the Lower East Side, Frederica's husband, Wolf, resumed his work as a peddler. Frederica also began peddling, selling lace door to door in streets thronged with men, women, and children, hawking everything from shoes, cheap jewelry, and fiddle strings to popcorn, oysters, and apple pie. For any one peddler, the odds against being able to sell enough to keep body and soul together were overwhelming. Frederica could easily have been trapped in that life forever, but we know from what followed that she recognized something vital very early, that it was the accrual of capital rather than wage work that would be the only ticket out of poverty. To make that leap, as she knew, she'd have to quit peddling and strike out on her own as a solo entrepreneur. But without any startup capital, how could she even begin? For a woman as smart and determined as she, the answer was clear. By looking around and seeing exactly what it was that people wanted to buy, but not pay full price for. Mrs. Mandelbaum had arrived in New York amid an explosion of stuff and a corresponding explosion of desire. Thanks to industrialization, the growth of cities, and the rise of professional work, a new American middle class had emerged. At the same time, mass production was making an immense array of consumer goods more widely available than ever. Newspapers and magazines lost no time in fanning the flames of middle-class longing with advertisements like these. Where Americans had once been mere purchasers, they were now consumers under pressure to keep up with the Joneses by transforming their homes into showplaces of modern material culture, awash in fine furniture, paintings, carpets, curtains, decorative lamps, knickknacks, bric-a-brac, and every kind of fancy tchotchke. Well, even a middle-class family couldn't afford all of those things, not at full price anyhow. But as these new bourgeois men and women discovered, they could solve the problem handily through clandestine visits to their friendly neighborhood tenants. And so Mrs. Mandelbaum began to capitalize, literally capitalize, by filling the gap in the market that she had discerned at the nexus of thrift, stuff, class, and design. During her first decade in America, she began handling goods brought to her furtively by Lower East Side pickpockets and penny thieves. She asked no questions about provenance and quickly turned around and resold the swag at a profit. By the end of that decade, around 1859, she had amassed enough capital to forsake peddling entirely and set herself up as a full-time entrepreneur. Frederica Mandelbaum had become a professional fence. The economics of the transaction worked as follows. Suppose, Rebecca, suppose you are a thief, you're moonlighting, and you bring me, Mother Mandelbaum, a handsome gold watch. I don't know where it came from, and I don't want to know, but what I do know, and know well, is the market. I have the wholesale price of every item I handle burned into my brain. So on receiving the watch, I pay you, the thief, 10 to 25% of its wholesale value, leaving me an enormous margin. You then execute the entire buy, and in relative safety too, for part of my job is to serve as a layer of insulation between thief and police. And in fact, the word offense in his name comes from defense, spelled in the British language with the city. Next, after I eradicate any identifying marks on the watch, I consult my minimized list of private customers, see who's in the market for a nice gold watch, and quietly sell it on them. I charge the customer half to 2/3 of wholesale, giving him an excellent bargain and myself an excellent profit. This simple business model served Mother Mandelbaum brilliantly throughout her working life. And while she would buy and resell almost anything of value, one 19th century newspaper article reports that she once resold 50,000 stolen cigars. Like any good business person, she specialized in certain products. Throughout her 25-year run as a criminal receiver, Mrs. Mandelbaum specialized in two things: silk and diamonds. Now, I'm going to also credit you for a minute. I'd like all of you to take just a moment to consider those two choices. Out of the hundreds of consumer goods flooding mid-19th century America, why those things in particular, silk and diamonds? Chew on it for just a second. Go ahead and raise your hand if you think you have the answer. Anyone? Yes, this one.
Trace.
You're getting warmer. But lots of other things can be made hard to trace. Well, I'll tell you. For Mrs. Mandelbaum, specializing in silk and diamonds was an eminently sound business decision because both of those commodities have immense value relative to their weight. By the 1860s, she was moving up in the underworld, and her crew had diversified, gentrified really, from petty thieves to some of America's most accomplished house breakers, burglars, and jewel thieves. And here is her actual crew. In order to make their assignments as safe and as cost-effective as possible, she needed to direct them to steal things that could be lifted imperceptibly and absconded with quickly, but which, even in small quantities, would yield maximum profit. Under Lauren's direction, the women in her organization were in charge of the small, high-value items, and they set to work with the silk scarves, kid gloves, cashmere shawls, and jewelry from the new mercantile pleasure houses that would soon be known as department stores. Her male employees got the heftier assignments, including lifting heavy boats of silk in quantity from warehouses and waterfront docks. But it would take one last major change in American material culture for Mother Mandelbaum to bring into her organization the most daring crooks of all, the bank burglars. Now, movies and TV have given us the impression that heisting banks was always a going concern in America. But in fact, until the 1860s, bank burglary and safeguarding were relatively rare. The reason harks back to colonial times. In the 17th and 18th centuries, each of the 13 colonies issued its own paper money at some point. But all of it was crudely printed and therefore easily counterfeited. Take a look and see what I mean. And apologies to Ben Franklin, who printed the one on the lower right. It's very easy to copy. So as a result, when American independence came along, the framers of the Constitution empowered Congress to coin money, but made no provision whatsoever for printing it. And so for the nation's first 3/4 of a century, gold and silver were literally coin of the realm. Now think for a moment about the problems this might pose for anyone longing to separate a bank from its contents. A man heists a mess of gold, and then what? Then has to go clanking heavily and loudly down the street. As a result, criminals tended to give banks a wide berth. Then came the Civil War, and with it the Union's urgent need to raise the money to wage it. In the early 1860s, President Lincoln empowered the government to issue fiat money, paper tender backed not by gold or silver, but simply by the government's word. And in this still from our trailer, you can see our reproduction 19th century money. You can see from my hand in shot for scale, that was the actual size. It was enormous. And I'll have some reproduction 19th century money on the book table for people to take as souvenirs. And good bookmarks for videos. So by the mid 1860s, the government had issued nearly $500 million in this paper money, equal to almost $9 billion today. And in the underworld, there was much rejoicing. Remember Mother Mandelbaum's golden rule. You go after things that have great value relative to weight. Well, paper money, by its very nature, has just that. And so for Mrs. Mandelbaum, the way forward was clear. The time had come to hide the bank was clear. She gathered around her some of the country's foremost burglars, men who had cut their teeth plundering the stately homes and fancy shops of America. Under her direction, they chose the most opportune banks to burgle, plotted the best means of entry, and surveilled the bank and surrounding neighborhood. A process of planning, revision, and rehearsal that could take months or even years. Like an angel investing in a Broadway show, Mother Mandelbaum underwrote their expenses, spending thousands to have bespoke sets of the latest burglar tools, custom made. There are 3 major bank burglaries recounted in the account of Mrs. Mandelbaum, but we have time today for me to tell you only that they could be hugely profitable, netting hundreds of thousands of dollars each time. That's hundreds of thousands in 19th century dollars. Mom Mandelbaum was reported to get as much as 50% of the take. And here's one of her men crawling through the wall toward the bank. But then, after 25 lucrative years, Mrs. Mandelbaum's reign as a crime lord drew to a close. American culture had changed. Increasingly, urban politics was controlled not by scrappy, up from the bootstraps immigrants, but by native-born, Ivy League educated WASP patricians. And in that climate of brazen female Jewish immigrants like Frederica Mandelbaum, who unabashedly did not know her place, had no place. And so in the mid-1880s, the forces of the law began conspiring to bring her down. After the Pinkertons raided her shop in 1884, Mrs. Mandelbaum was arrested, indicted, and scheduled to stand trial on multiple counts of grand larceny. But then, in a dazzling 11th-hour act of self-preservation, she pulled off one last cake worthy of a robe of her stature. And as a result of that cake, Rebecca Mandelbaum was actually able to I could tell you what happened next. I can also tell you how to figure out the combination to a bank vault, which are building in the 19th century, how to rob Tiffany and Company and get away with ditto. And above all, the answer to the question that seized hold of me that first day: how in the world a nice Jewish mother could preside for a quarter century over the most notorious crime scene in America. But if I told you, well, let's just say that would be cheating. And unlike our remarkable real-life protagonist, I am no cheat. So instead, I will say only thank you all so much for listening, and I'll be delighted to take your questions.
First come across her.
Will you repeat the question for everyone here?
The question was how did I first come across her? As I said, she was literally there for the taking, so I made no claim to have discovered her. Many books on New York City history, and obviously particularly on 19th century crime, mention her in passing. And in fact, Mrs. Mandelbaum has 3 or 4 cameo appearances in Herbert Asbury's Gangs of New York, the source material for the Scorsese film. So she was kind of always there, but her work was sort of presented in passing as a fait accompli. You know, oh yes, there was this lady crime boss in the 19th century, end of story. Well, not the end of the story, it should be the beginning of the story. And so I really thought, how could this preposterous situation actually be true? Because, there are 3 professions less hospitable to female management than organized crime. And yet, in her day, it was true. Right.
The first thing I'm thinking of as you're going through the story is she stood out like a sore thumb.
Yeah.
I mean, here's a Jewish woman from the tenements wearing gold and diamonds and silk. And, I think today they'd be on her in about a week. Second question, if I may. A movie with Kathy Baker starring as Mrs. Mandelbaum?
Kathy Bates.
Kathy Bates, yes.
So, yeah, no, we've all, I'm happy to say that my agent is in talks for some sort of possible screen adaptation. It's too early for me to say much publicly, but everyone's favorite parlor game, including mine, is who would be cast to play Mrs. M. 20 years ago, I would have said Streisand, because you want just this big, dominating, proudly Jewish figure. Now, I'm not quite sure. Or 60 years ago, I would have said Gertrude Berg, who played the mother in right. You guys know, she would have been perfect.
I would think Barbara Streisand would be perfect today. She's about the same.
Right, well, it depends. I mean, even if you don't start the story until she comes to America, you have to age Mrs. Mandelbaum from age 25 to age 69, which was the last year of her house. So, you sort of want to split the difference on hired actors in her 40s, but or multiple actors
Right.
at different periods in her life. Yes.
I noticed that the newspaper articles mentioned her son Julius. So did her son have a major role? Did her other children, was it a family enterprise?
Yes and no. After her baby daughter Berta died, the couple went on to have 4 more children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. And in a classic case of 19th century entrepreneurship, she brought the sons into the business, but not the girls. So, so Julius and another employee were arrested with her. It has already been alluded to about the husband, but it's very interesting. I think she had kind of a don't ask, don't tell relationship with her own husband. There's a wonderful quote from a man with a wonderful name, George Washington Walling, who was chief of police in New York during Mandelbaum's heyday. And he said, and it's so good, the quote was burned into my brain, contemplating the Mandelbaums as a couple, he said, the woman took the lead in these nefarious transactions. Was a thorough businesswoman. Her husband was a non-entity, a devilish. And so I think he was not involved in the business as far as anyone knows. He kind of turned a blind eye to it, and he died probably of consumption in 1875, leaving her as the sole, very capable support of those 4 children. All the way in the back.
Okay, my question is a simple one. As we all know, inherited money's passed on, and most of the billionaires, except the electronics people, acquired their money from Papa. How are any of her descendants alive, and are they wealthy?
When I was working on the book, I was able to trace her descendants down only 2 generations to the level of her grandchildren. And we know this because in the 1920s, a young woman named Dorothy Lauer was arrested a couple of times for petty crimes in New York, once passing a bad check, once stealing a fur muff from another woman. Dorothy Lauer turned out to be Frederica's granddaughter, the daughter of her oldest daughter, Sarah. And once the New York papers got wind of the connection, they had a field day determining this woman's connection to her far more famous grandmother. But she was just a petty criminal. I think Frederica was her crimes in contempt. I have heard, since the book has been out, from some people who maintain that they have done the work on Ancestry.com and maybe descended from her. I don't think they're rich. And I would say, without wanting to create any spoilers or any more spoilers, I will say that she lived the last 10 years of her life as a fugitive from the law in exile. And so when that happens, you are very often not able to bring your fortune with you. So I have a feeling what you did have just got dissipated, very quickly within a generation or 2. Yes, over here.
What kind of Jewish community life did she lead? Was she involved in the Jewish
So
community?
really, she absolutely was. She was apparently a regular congregant and a generous benefactor of her shul, Road of Shalom, then on the Lower East Side. It's now a Reform shul on the Upper West Side. And I'm often asked, was she a charitable benefactor just as kind of a front to, and I think, or did she genuinely have conviction as a Jew? And I think it's the latter. And I will tell you how we know. When writing nonfiction, particularly nonfiction where your subject has left no papers, you have to be beyond careful in imputing thought or imputing intent to someone. There's no record going on inside their head, but there's a really interesting anecdotal, strong suggestion that she was a committed Jew. As I said, during the last 10 years of her life, she was a fugitive living in another country. During that time, her youngest daughter, Annie, the one who ran in an open safe in the beginning of the story, died of pneumonia in New York. She was just 18 years old. And Frederica knew if she even set foot in the United States to see her beloved child one last time, she would surely be arrested. So she went anyway, probably in disguise, made a clandestine farewell visit to her beloved daughter. Now, the New York papers were full of the news of the daughter's death. Mrs. Mandelbaum's pretty daughter died. The papers ate it up. And so it was well established that the cops would be watching Jewish burial grounds around the city in the hope of nabbing Frederica when she came to the funeral. So some clever person in Frederica's entourage suggested, look, let's give the kid a Christian burial instead. The cops were looking at him. And, it's an eminently practical suggestion. Frederica would not hear. She insisted that Annie be buried in Jewish tradition, and indeed she was, whatever he was to them. So I find that incredibly moving. And that tells me that, at least on some level, she thought of herself as a committed Jew.
Curiously, I have a great-great-grandfather named Julius Mandelbaum, who was a peddler in Iowa. Any chance there's a connection there?
It's not for me to say, what I mean is there's no way to know, and, obviously, particularly in those early generations. Being named Julius Mandelbaum would be like being maybe John Smith if you were lost, there were so many, so. Who's to say, but it certainly might be investigating.
I have a question. So you showed us the pictures of her crew. How do we know that those are her crew? Was there a list somewhere? Or did the police sort of figure it out? Like you see the big boards where they're like connected. How do we know that was her crew?
She applied for trade largely in the open, and so her activities and the activities of her subalterns were chronicled in the papers at the time. They would say this bank has been robbed by these three guys, and they, are well known to work for Mother Mandelbaum, the notorious consultants. And then indeed, both the photographs and engravings were from rogues galleries assembled by the police. So we have both contemporaneous and then slightly later documentation of that. All the way back.
How long did it take you to put the story together in searching?
The research actually took longer than the writing because of you'll see, those of you who would care about the book, there's probably 50 pages of bibliography and notes in the back because of the way I had to work with a real dearth of primary sources. So the research probably took over a year, and at the normally at the end of that reading period for any one of my books, when I type up my notes, I'll have 600 or 800 pages of notes. This time I had 1,200 pages of notes, and I literally had to lie down to convince myself that I could do it. And it took me 2 months just to go through the notes and know what I had. The actual writing was a walk in the park. It took maybe 9 months. Yes.
Well, there were 2 sons. Do they have any history of violence?
No. As I'm not a historian, but my understanding from reading the literature is the violence that we think, courtesy of movies and TV, that we automatically think of as being associated with organized crime, really didn't come into that Prohibition era Hating. Had the guys with spats and pinstripes and big machine guns, but no, certainly she and not her sons, for anything I read, they weren't having people whacked. They weren't having people's kneecaps broken. And that's one of the things that I feel allowed me to give myself permission to go ahead and write the story. There's no gainsaying she was a career criminal. We don't hide that. Kids stay in school, don't try this at home. But, she was smart and scrappy and feisty and determined, and she outwitted a lot of people who were after her who were no more or less moral than she. And so there is a lot to be interested in, if not outright celebrate.
Did you have access to New York City police records from that period? And are there any? And how extensive are they?
There is a wonderful archive called the Municipal Archives of New York City that has papers related to all kinds of New York City departments going back to colonial times. And so I did a lot of research still with COVID and post-COVID restriction, but their staff very kindly unearthed a lot of additional microfilms from something called the DA scrapbooks, where the district attorney's office usually have people actually flipping things and pasting them. And then they found her indictment.
For what?
We have time for one more question. Yeah.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
how to choose? All right.
As a woman, I'm very interested in how she could become who she was. In other words, she was a loving, she fit the female role as a loving mother and a mentor and wanting to take care of her family, but there was nothing in the criminal world or the legal world to mentor her or to be a role model. I mean, obviously she was smart, but there had to be and determined, but there had to be something else. And I'm just wondering what you think that
Well,
was.
she was mentored, and in fact, I didn't have time to go into the talk when it's in the book, but it was she. During the 1850s, she came under the mentorship of two older Jewish men who were master criminal seekers themselves. But she is certainly the first and perhaps only woman that I am aware of to have risen that high, formed so lucrative a business and sustained for so long. So yes, you're right, in that sense, she was absolutely paving her own way. Albeit in the underworld, but it's still, it's, you know, there's much to admire nonetheless.
I have one quick question. Fun. Did she have any romances?
Again, it's on the book, so we know that after her husband died, she took a lover who was a German, a Gentile of German background, and the interesting thing about Klein Deutschland is the affinities were really more along shared language than shared religion, and German-speaking Jews and Gentiles lived and worked together, socialized together, you know, went to the German-style beer halls together. And so her lover was one of her employees. He was one of the 3 people arrested on the day of the Pinkerton Day, but Marm being Marm, he was her total subordinate. He had no hand in actual management decisions.
I know there are more questions. She will be signing books. You can ask the questions at the book signing.
Thanks, Margolit, for that really unique travelogue to the Gilded Age. But I'd like to call on you, please, Marjorie, if you would help us. We have a wonderful raffle, and we'd like you to choose the recipients, if you don't mind.
Well, we could fence the winning number.
Janet, last time you get it with B, tell me. Janet.
I'll get it. I think she might be easier if I get it. It's 3 books in case anyone's curious.
Joe, Beasy?
So I think we just have the one, right?
Oh, is that? Oh, okay.
Sorry, Joe, you're out of luck.
Right.
On behalf of the Jewish Federation, I'm Rebecca. Hi, I want to thank you all for coming out. I want to take just one moment. Can you just take a moment for Myra? She would have loved this. This was her favorite event. We can open the table for her. She was so nice. So if we could just use one moment of silence and just think about Myra and how much she would really enjoy this presentation. So it's really nice. Again, there are books for sale. There's still food left if you're still hungry. And Margolit would be signing the books right out here at the door. Thank you all very much.
I didn't hear what she said. This is so. Yeah, but. Okay.
I think I know. I'm ready to go down and do that side of it. And I'm sorry. My parents. They're talking about this way. Oh, no, this is our shoe. My mom was just very involved in book basketball. Carry on this. And I guess they don't need some pictures up here. Thank you. Oh, gotcha. Yeah, I don't, I never, I came once or twice over there. I was like a luncheon or something. It's really, you heard about it all the time. Sure. Almost the same. Family took all the. Let me just make sure.
They're fine, it's the same. I know. It's the same.
I'm sure I read that.
I like this. I don't think they have okay. It's really hard.
Yeah, how it goes, you're saying that they're in law school, and that's it, and then, I'm like, oh my god, that's
Yeah, you spent all that time. Yeah, I agree. I've never actually seen on this yet. I guess I never got above that.
Yeah, we don't want to talk about it.
So, Rebecca.
I can.
Oh, sure. Let me